Historical geology students. This is the third video for the week of March 24th, 2020. I hope you're all doing all right there during this your time at home. What we're going to do is continue on with Chapter 9, and all these PowerPoints that you have in front of you are from your book. So you can look through your textbook and you can see all of these videos again. What we left off talking about was, again, we're in the Proterozoic Era, and the Proterozoic Era goes from 2.5 billion years ago to 542 million years ago. So this chapter ends at about 542 million years ago. 542 million years ago, the Phanerozoic Eon began. That's what the next couple chapters are going to focus on. And also the big event that you need to remember that happened 542 million years ago was the Cambrian explosion, when most modern life forms appeared on planet Earth. We'll talk about that later. For now, we're going to focus on the Proterozoic Eon. What does this word mean, Laurentia? Well, Laurentia refers to ancient North America. North America before 542 million years ago is called Laurentia. And here you can see on your screen these orange rocks. In these areas here, mostly up in Canada, we find lots of Proterozoic rocks preserved. And the history of North America is preserved there. So another way of thinking about it is that Laurentia is the ancient heart of North America. Here you can see a picture from your book. This is North America today with its coastlines. Here you can see Florida, Texas, Alaska, Northwest Territories up in Canada. All of these areas in orange, blue, and purple were formed during the Proterozoic and the Archean. Another way of saying it is all of these areas in white did not exist 1.8 billion years ago. Let me ask you a question here as you're sitting there at home. Did Tennessee exist 1.8 billion years ago? No, because it's in this white area. Alaska did not exist 1.8 billion years ago. All this area here where I'm tracing out, that's the ancient coastline of Laurentia 1.8 billion years ago. So bottom line is, before 1.8 billion years ago, all of these little cratons collided together to form this ancient North America. Keep this picture in mind, and we're going to look at and see how Laurentia changes. Now we're going to 1.65 to 1.76 billion years ago. Let's compare. Here's that picture I showed you before. How has Laurentia changed? Well, these areas in green and blue were added on to the southeastern margin of Laurentia. So Laurentia starts to grow towards the southeast. How does it grow? Well, these areas here were subduction zones. And Yavapai province, you can see here, was accreted. Accreted means it was added on to the southeastern margin of Laurentia. And so you had a continental convergent plate boundary, and Yavapai province might have been an island, and it was sutured on to the southeastern margin of Laurentia. After that, Mazatlan province was added through another collision along this ancient convergent plate boundary. So bottom line is, from 1.65 to 1.76 billion years ago, in the Proterozoic Eon, Laurentia grows towards the southeast. Now we're going to move forwards in time to 1.0 to 1.3 billion years ago. At that time, you could see Laurentia's growing even more along its southeastern margin. The Grenville province was added on. And then you can see the Granite Rhyolite province was added on. So now we're getting into, this is just about where Nashville is. So Knoxville, this area here still didn't exist yet, but all of this area here to here towards the southeast was added onto the margin of Laurentia. So the story of Laurentia is it's growing, it's getting bigger, and it's growing primarily along its southeastern margin as small islands collide with the southeastern coastline and add new land to the ancient heart of North America, which we call, once again, Laurentia. Here you can see a photograph showing you parts of the Grenville orogeny. This is up in upstate New York. This land was added on to the southeastern margin of Laurentia. She's standing here right in front of some rocks here that were added on during the Proterozoic Eon as Laurentia continued to grow towards its southeast. And they also ask you a question here, which is kind of useful, and I want you to think about this when you're listening to this. Look at these beds here. They're tilted this way. And these up here are deposited horizontal. Think to yourself for a moment. What type of unconformity is this? Is it A, a nonconformity, B, an angular unconformity, or C, a disconformity? Now think about it, and I'll pause for 10 seconds while you think about it. Okay, you need to be able to recognize these. This is what we call a angular unconformity. The reason why is because you have sedimentary rocks above and below, but the ones below are dipping in a different direction than those above. And it's formed by uplift and erosion, you might recall. So the continents grow during the Proterozoic Eon. Next topic I wanted to talk about was supercontinents. We all learned about Pangaea and Alfred Wegener and the continent that existed 245 million years ago. But now we're going to learn about two supercontinents that formed during the Proterozoic Eon. The first one, and the first one geologists know about, is the supercontinent of Columbia, which existed about 1.6 billion years ago. This is the first known supercontinent. Here you can see we could trace the ancient coastlines of this supercontinent by using James Hutton's principle of uniformitarianism. The present is the key to the past. We can find ancient coastal deposits here. So, things like beach sands, which marked the ancient coastlines. And we can go back in the past and know that there was a supercontinent. Please don't forget the first one we know of, and it's called Columbia, 1.6 billion years ago. The next supercontinent we're going to look at, and you want to remember, is Rodinia. 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 Rodinia existed 1 billion years ago. And you can see 1 billion years ago, here's ancient North America. We call that Laurentia. And it's connected to all the other continents. They all came together at continental convergent plate boundaries. They got sutured together to make the supercontinent of Rodinia, which existed about 1 billion years ago. Another thing that happened that was quite important was we had something occur about 600 million years ago. That was something that never occurred before, as far as we know, and never occurred afterwards. And that is, most of the planet, or some people think all of the planet, was covered by ice. How do we know that? Well, when you go to rocks that are 600 million years old, we find that they're almost all made of this unsorted sedimentary rock. This happens to be a breccia, but this unsorted rock is formed in places like Canada or Antarctica or Greenland, where you have glaciers. Glaciers are thick accumulations of ice, hundreds or thousands of feet thick, and they produce this type of sedimentary rock. What happened 600 million years ago? Well, some people call it the snowball Earth. And the way the snowball Earth works is this. The Earth started to cool down about 600 million years ago. And more of the planet was covered by snow. Snow has a high albedo, albedo. Now, what I want to talk about next is, what is albedo? Albedo. Albedo. Albedo is a term used by scientists that is used to measure the amount of sunlight an object can reflect. The amount of sunlight, or the albedo of a material, is highly dependent on its color. People like to say that snow, white snow, has a high albedo. And what that means is that snow reflects almost all of the sunlight. A dark material has a low albedo. It absorbs sunlight. Have you ever noticed that when you go up to Canada, more people buy dark colored cars? Why is that? Because it absorbs sunlight. It keeps the car warmer. So during those cold Canadian days, you don't have to spend as much heating your car. And here down south in Tennessee, as you go down to Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, there's more lighter colored cars because they have a higher albedo. They reflect more sunlight. Keeping that in mind, think about what happened 600 million years ago with the snowball Earth. The Earth cooled. Glaciers started to cover the planet. More and more of the planet was covered by this high albedo glacial ice. That means more and more of the sunlight was being reflected. That led to an acceleration of the cooling. There's a movie called Day After Tomorrow. I don't know if you've ever seen it, where the whole planet ends up getting covered up with ice. I think it has Kevin Costner in it. He's the actor, and he's trying to save his family, and the ice is moving so fast, like 20 miles an hour and 30 miles an hour, and he's trying to get away from the ice. That's an exaggeration. That's not the way it was, but the Earth did get covered by ice, due to this runaway snowball effect, this accelerated cooling due to the more and more sunlight being reflected back into the atmosphere by this high albedo snow. The whole planet ended up getting covered up by ice. We know that happened about 600 million years ago. Luckily, later on, the ice melted, and when that happened, um, you started to see the land be exposed again, and you had rivers and lakes, and uh, things went back to normal again. Here you can see that much of the planet was covered by ice. You can see the areas in light green were covered by ice. Though at one point, about 600 million years ago, we think the whole planet was covered by ice. I mentioned before in the previous chapter when we were talking about the Archean eon that we did find stromatolites in Archean rocks. And I mentioned before that stromatolites, let me show you what those are once again, are the first fossils we find in the rock record. Stromatolites look like this. And these little mounds here are from northeastern Australia in a place called Sharks Bay, are made of trillions of little tiny creatures called cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria. These tiny little bacteria photosynthesize. They invented the technology of photosynthesis, where you take carbon dioxide and water and you make food and oxygen. They are the ones who invented photosynthesis. The plants stole that technology later on. Anyway, by Archean time, we still had these stromatolites, and all the evidence indicates, and you want to remember this, that during the Proterozoic, oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere increased. Now, how do we know that's the case? How do we know that oxygen concentrations increased? Well, the reason why we know is because of these rocks that are very common in the Proterozoic. We do not find them in Archean rocks. These are only found in the Proterozoic, and they are called banded iron formations. Some people call them BIFs, B-I-F. And you might never have seen these rocks before, unless you've been up to northern Michigan, northern Minnesota, or Canada. But these are very common rocks in Canada. Notice they have layers of red separated by layers of gray. The red layers are made up of the mineral hematite, 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 Hematite. That's an oxidized form of iron. And the gray layers are made up of another iron mineral called magnetite, Magnetite, magnetite. And the significance of this is that in the modern day world, when you have iron, it's going to get rusted. Why? Because we have a lot of oxygen in our atmosphere. And in the ancient world, though, we started to form these red layers in here, indicating that oxygen is becoming more common. You didn't find those in Archean rocks. The oxygen layers oxygen was not as high as in the modern day, though, because we have these gray layers. We don't form these gray layers anymore. Our rocks become completely red nowadays. Iron will completely get oxidized. But back then we didn't have as much oxygen. At the same time, we had a lot more oxygen than we had in the Archean because we have these red layers. So oxygen starts to build up in the atmosphere. That's going to have implications for life because advanced life forms need more oxygen. Another thing you want to know about these BIFs, banded iron formations, is that these are our main source of iron ore. The U.S. steel industry is not as big as it used to be back when I was your age. U.S. Steel used to be big, but we signed some stupid trade agreement called NAFTA, which really hurt our steel industry. Anyway, in the steel industry, the main iron ore we use is banded iron formations, BIFs. And nowadays, we import most of our iron ore, these banded iron formation rocks, from Canada. Here you can see one of the few mines left open in the United States after NAFTA, and it's in northern Michigan. And you can see that they're mining iron ore. And they shape this iron ore into pellets, and then it's smelted. When we start talking about Proterozoic life, what we're starting, this is the most common type of Proterozoic life: single-celled, primitive, microscopic, very low intelligence. And these are found from Ontario, Canada, in the Gunflint Chert. In the Gunflint Chert has a lot of these beautiful little bacteria here. And these are asexual creatures. Do you remember? Are asexual creatures prokaryotes or eukaryotes? You should remember that they are prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are sexual organisms and include animals, plants, fungus, and protists. So, don't forget, please, the Linnaean classification scheme that we talked about in the last chapter: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We have here in this picture what a prokaryotic cell looks like, what a eukaryotic cell looks like. Prokaryotic cells include bacteria and archaea. Eukaryotic cells include protista, single-celled eukaryotes, funguses, plants, and animals. You should also remember that are plants consumers or producers? You should remember they're producers because they produce their own food. Animals are consumers. They consume food. Plants do photosynthesis. Animals do respiration. Don't forget that our DNA in eukaryotes is stored in chromosomes, in pairs of chromosomes, inside of a cell nucleus. Eukaryote cells are larger than prokaryotic cells. The DNA of prokaryotes is spread throughout the cell instead of in chromosomes. Another thing, prokaryotic cells have suborganelles, parts of the cell that are walled off from the rest of the cell and serve a specific function. For plants, you have things like chloroplasts, which help convert sunlight into food through photosynthesis. Animals have mitochondria that convert the food they eat into energy. So, without getting into this too much, you need to remember 3 domains of life: domain archaea, domain eubacteria. In English, it's bacteria. In Latin, is eubacteria. And then eukaryotes, these 4: kingdom protista, kingdom fungi, kingdom plantae, and kingdom animalia. Protists are single-celled. They're the most primitive of your eukaryotes. They include algae, lots of type of plankton. Funguses include yeasts, molds, and mushrooms. They are decomposers. What's that mean? Well, they live on dead things. You ever go in your backyard and look at the logs or rotting wood and see these the fungus and the lichens that are growing on top of the wood? Those are funguses. Or you ever see how mushrooms grow off of something that has died, such as wood? They decompose they decompose dead tissue. Plants are organisms that reproduce by photosynthesis. We call them producers. And they are also called autotrophs, Autotrophs, because they produce their own food. Animals are consumers, and they are heterotrophs because they do respiration and they eat. They eat, they drink water, they release, they eat, they breathe, they release water, and they release carbon dioxide. It's called respiration. So, one of the things that's real important to remember is sexual organisms, eukaryotes, appeared during the Proterozoic, about 1.2 billion years ago. It's not a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, that at the same time that eukaryotes appear on the planet, BIFs appear, banded iron formations appear. As soon as the oxygen concentrations were high enough, we could produce more complex life forms like these eukaryotes. And these are visible to the naked eye. These are the first complex organisms. They might not appear complex to you, but they're much more complex than what existed prior. So the eukaryotes known for sexual life, gender appears. Eukaryotes appear 1.2 million years ago. Macrofossils, fossils visible to the naked eye, appear. Oxygen concentrations increase at the same time and cause the evolution of these eukaryotes, these more complex life forms. Here you can see that these things are called acritarchs, 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 and these are eukaryote organisms. These are algal cysts, cysts, and these are visible to the naked eye and are some of the first eukaryotes. So, an interesting question now has to be answered. During the Archean, we had fossils, but they were all prokaryotes. Now, all of a sudden, 1.2 billion years ago, 1.5 billion years ago, some people think eukaryotes appear. How did we go from a world that contained only prokaryotes to our first eukaryotes? Most people think that occurred due to a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic. Let me spell that for you. Symbiotic. A symbiotic relationship. What is a symbiotic relationship? Organisms have symbiotic relationships. And symbiotic relationships I'm going to write it here so you can see it. Symbiotic relationships can be mutual symbiotic relationships, or they can be parasitic symbiotic relationships. What is a mutual symbiotic relationship? A mutual symbiotic relationship is one where both species benefit. For example, inside of your body are trillions of bacteria, and these bacteria are friendly bacteria. They help you digest your food. If it wasn't for these bacteria that are living inside you right now, you wouldn't live. You both partners benefit. The human benefits from having these bacteria that helps us digest our food in a safe way. We couldn't live without them. These bacteria benefit by having us. We're like their house. They live within us. And so they need us. Without us, they cannot survive. There are many types of other types of symbiotic relationships. I'll just give you another one. There's a little bird that lives in Africa, and it lives on top of rhinoceros that are tens of thousands of times bigger than it. The rhinoceros could easily kill this bird, but it lets that bird fly on top of it because it gets a benefit. The bird picks lice and other parasites, leeches, off of the rhinoceros. It cleans this surface of the skin for the rhinoceros. Both benefit. The bird benefits because it gets a feeding platform. The rhinoceros gets deloused. That's what we call a mutual symbiotic relationship. A marriage should be a mutual symbiotic relationship where both parties benefit from the marriage. A parasitic symbiotic relationship is where one benefits and one suffers. Kind of reminds me, well, let's say, for example, let me show you here. There's a type of fish called a lamprey. It looks like this. You can see it's got all of these teeth on it. And what the lamprey does is it attaches itself to a fish and sucks the blood out of it, sucks everything out of it until it kills the fish. That's a parasitic symbiotic relationship. It sucks everything out of that fish. The fish gets sicker and sicker. Its guts are removed. Its vitality, its health is removed. And it leaves the fish as an empty husk. So there's nothing left. It reminds me of my ex-wife. Everything is removed from you. Everything is gone. Your furniture's gone. Your kids are gone. Your bank account's drained. You're drained, and you're this man sitting in a bar talking with other men about their ex-wives. That is a parasitic relationship, if you ask me. Sorry about that. I thought you missed my humor, so I thought I'd give you some. Anyway, it's a true story, though. Anyway, so what kind of parasitic symbiotic relationships can you think of? Well, how about leeches and lice? We don't get anything from them. They get something from us. That's a parasitic symbiotic relationship. So now we know what symbiotic relationships are. Let's talk about how we went from a world of prokaryotes to a world of eukaryotes. Here you can see a prokaryotic cell up here. This is from your book. And you can see other prokaryotes here. These are called aerobic bacteria. We think that about 1.5 billion years ago, that these prokaryotes took in these prokaryotes. We don't know if it was a voluntary thing or if it was a forced thing. In other words, we don't know if these larger prokaryotes allowed for these aerobic bacteria to enter into them, become part of them, or if they captured these smaller aerobic bacteria. This happens all the time in nature. So these prokaryotes started to become a single unit, and they both benefited. The larger prokaryotic host would benefit by having these aerobic bacteria within them, because these aerobic bacteria can eat and bring in food to this larger host, and the host would be a benefit to the aerobic bacteria because it would provide a large place for these aerobic bacteria to dwell. They would become part of a larger organism, and they would get some protection from that. And after a while, what happens is, after millions of generations of them just living within a single body, they will become a single unit, so they are no longer separate. This is what we call a symbiotic relationship. A mutual symbiotic relationship. That's how we think we went from a world of prokaryotes to eukaryotes. Plants might have taken in photosynthetic bacteria, and those ended up becoming the chloroplasts of these plants. Animals might have taken in what used to be separate mitochondria, these aerobic bacteria, and they became part and parcel of animal cells. So through these mutual symbiotic relationships, we go from a world of prokaryotes to a world of eukaryotes. Eukaryotes, as you can see, they have these suborganelles. And we go from a world of no gender to a world of gender. And the eukaryotes appeared about 1.5 billion years ago, please don't forget, during the Proterozoic. Another thing about the Proterozoic is when we went from a world of unicellular life to multicellular life. Here you can see one of the first multicellular organisms. It's called gonium. Here's another one called Volvox. So organisms, we're seeing a trend here. We're going from a world of asexual life to sexual life. We're going from a world of microscopic to larger creatures. We're going a world from unicellular to multicellular. Life is becoming more complex and bigger. Last thing I want to talk about in this part of the video is the Ediacaran fauna. What is the Ediacaran fauna? Well, here you can see some Ediacaran fauna fossils. These are organisms that lived from 560 to 580 million years ago. These are your first large creatures preserved in the rocks. Some people think they're related to modern day organisms. Some people think they're an evolutionary dead end. But the important thing is that complex life forms did appear with the Ediacaran fauna. These are your first large organisms, and they occurred at the very end of the Proterozoic. What I want you to do, please, is go onto YouTube. Oh, actually, I'll just do it for you here. And here's a 3-minute, 15-second video on the Ediacaran fauna. So just listen to this. It's pretty good.
This slideshow is an overview of some of the fossils known as the Ediacaran fauna, a diverse group of organisms that lived in the world's oceans about 580 to 550 million years ago. While some scientists think that these fossils represent the earliest animals, others think they might not be related to anything still living today. Here we'll show you some images of fossils from Mistaken Point Biological Reserve in Newfoundland, Canada, and from the Flinders region of South Australia. These These frond-like forms are thought to have been attached to the seafloor and stood upright in the water column, probably filtering out small particles of food that drifted by. These disc-shaped forms, called aspidella, are thought by some to represent the parts of frond-shaped organisms that attach to the seafloor, and are sometimes referred to as holdfasts for this reason. These ridged oval forms are called Dickinsonia. They range in size from a few centimeters to tens of centimeters in length. Some scientists think that Dickinsonia is related to modern-day animals called Placozoa, a primitive aquatic invertebrate organism. This strange three-branched spiral form is called Tribrachidium. This eight-armed form is called Eoandromeda. The specimen here is from Australia. Eoandromeda is also found in China. This fossil is called Spergina. It has ends that look different from each other, as well as bilateral symmetry, which means its right half is a mirror image of its left half. This small fossil is called Parvancorina. It too has bilateral symmetry. This fossil, called Kimbarella, is often considered to be the oldest bilaterian animal fossil, based on its similarity to some groups of modern-day mollusks. This fossil, called Fumecia, is found in Australia and often lived in dense groupings of related individuals.
Okay, there we go. So that's the end of Chapter 9. The Proterozoic Eon ended 542 million years ago. 542 million years ago, there was a great explosion of life on our planet. That's called the Cambrian explosion. I'm going to send you videos starting with Chapter 10 next week. And so I'm going to send you a whole bunch of videos next week to watch. I'm going to send you lab quizzes, as I mentioned before in my messages. I'll send you more messages to keep you informed so you know what to do during the semester, so we can do this online. Everybody stay safe. And keep an eye out for these videos. And if you have any questions, email me.